How's it going, gang? Welcome back to a very special episode of Plaid Hobbies. It took a bit of time, but the 1,000 subscriber voted video is finally here. Of all the options that we put out, you guys voted for some loyalist Emperor's Children. Not gonna lie, when I saw that Emperor's Children were winning the vote, my heart started palpitating a bit, thinking back to burning myself out with the last Emperor's Children video. But that was 33 models, this is only gonna be 3, so there shouldn't be any issues this time. Anyway, without further ado, let's get hobbying. First thing that I had to decide is what the base kit is going to be to convert these guys. I still have a bin full of Space Marines from both before and when I started playing Warhammer. I'm thinking these Assault Intercessors from the 9th edition starter kit would work perfectly. I was thinking of saving these guys for my Space Marine army, but I still got 7 of them left, so shouldn't be a big deal there. I picked out the 3 best looking ones and got planning. First thing I did was grab some 3D printed conversion bits, just for swapping out the helmets and the shoulders. Sadly, these Marines are push fit, which means the shoulders are all one piece with the arms, so I'm gonna have to do some plastic surgery to remove them. I started roughly cutting off chunks of the shoulders with my sprue cutters. I didn't have to be super clean for this part since I was going to be shaving these more down precisely later. Once I got the general shape down, I used my hobby blade to shave it all down even more, getting it to a perfect contour to fit the shoulder. It wasn't perfect, but it's good enough to work. Next up, I wanted to swap out their melee weapons. I think chainswords are awesome, but these are Emperor's Children. They need more elegant weapons from a more civilized age. I still have some leftover dueling sabers from the Infractor's kit. The size matched the chain blades almost exactly, so these are going to be no problem to swap out. First, I removed the arm from the piece. The hand is sculpted pretty close to the hilt, so I have to be a little bit more delicate when cutting off and trimming these. After removing those and cleaning it up with some sanding sticks, they were ready to go. Next step was as easy as cutting off the chain blades right at the hilt. Now I got a nice flat surface to glue the blades onto. To do this, I used some plastic glue. This should help weld the two parts together and make it a lot more secure than using super glue. In theory, I should have pinned these, but I think this glue will work fine for now. I also forgot to remove the heads earlier, and now that I can't really reopen the models to remove these heads are gonna have to be sacrificed to Slaanesh. Now that the heads are off, I decided to glue down the printed shoulder pads using some super glue. I used some poster putty to temporarily hold the heads in place so I could work on those next. For the squad leader, I wanted to add a top knot to the helmet. Once again, Slaanesh has blessed me with tons of leftover bits from the Emperor's Children launch box, so I had plenty to work with. Once I cleaned them up, I got ready to attach them. Unlike the blades, I gotta super glue these since I'm attaching plastic to resin, so plastic cement wouldn't work on this. So because of this, I am deciding to pin these. I cut off a thin piece of wire and matched it to a similar sized pin vise and started drilling a hole to place it in. I also needed to quickly de-chaos the top knot, so I shaved off the spikes. Once that was smooth, I added some super glue and sandwiched everything together. It should be nice and secure now. Before moving on, I added a bit of plastic cement to clean up the rough cut marks on the top knot as well. I always try to use one-off projects like this to try out new things and improve on techniques that I feel like I could get better at. One thing that I'd love to try and master is custom sculpting, so I wanted to do something to test those out on these guys. I've always liked Space Marines with tabards, so I'm going to attempt to sculpt one onto the squad leader. This should also help him stand out a bit more among the other two. To sculpt the tabard, I broke out some milliput. I won't be needing a lot of putty for this, so I only rolled out slightly more than I needed. I dusted off the old sculpting tools from college and got to work. I wet my tools so the putty wouldn't stick, and I started placing the putty piece by piece onto the mini. I find doing it this way is a lot easier than adding one big flat sheet and morphing it into shape. I find I have a bit more control doing it this way, as I can add as little or as much as I want. One thing I've seen other sculptors do as well is putting a little bit of putty on the back of your thumb while you're sculpting. That way you always have a quick way to reach for a little bit of it. As I kept adding the putty, I swapped back and forth between a silicone sculpting tool and a wooden skewer, using water to help smooth out the transition between chunks of clay. I also can't stress enough how important reference images are for things like this. In this case, I looked up photos of different fabrics with different tension points to see how it hangs and what shapes they would make. Having a reference image like this right by your side that you can quickly glance at while sculpting will help you way more than trying to do it from just memory or guessing. Once I was satisfied with the top part, I worked on the bottom part of the tabard. This part was a bit harder since it's hanging, so I didn't have any backing to support the putty. Thankfully, this guy's legs aren't spread too far apart though, so I sculpted it in a way where both legs kind of act as contact points, giving it a bit more support while I sculpt. I used a larger, chunkier piece for this, then started slowly adding smaller chunks of clay to build up the folds. I used the silicone sculpting tool and some water to smooth out the folds and bend it in a way that simulated the motion this guy's moving in, making it flow backwards more as if the wind is pushing it back. Once I got it to a point I was satisfied with, I left it for 24 hours to harden. While that was curing, I decided to finish up any of the other kit bashing I wanted to do. I wanted to add a little tilting shield to the leader as well. I have a ton of these left over from other Space Marine kits. I started cutting, but my blade was way too dull. One thing I remember from college is that a dull blade is almost as dangerous as a sharp new one. If it's dull, that means you're going to be putting more pressure on it, which means you have a better chance of it slipping and hitting you. So just remember, a dull blade isn't sharp enough to cut through material, but it's sure as hell sharp enough to still cut through you. So please just always change your blades. Once the blade was swapped out, I shaved off a little bit of the Aquila to make a flat surface for the tilting shield to be attached to. I stuck it down with some plastic cement and left it to dry. While that's set, I grabbed their bolt pistols and started drilling out the barrels. I poked a guiding hole with my knife and then started drilling them out using my pin vise. I don't know how I did it, but I somehow managed to botch one of them and it completely destroyed the barrel. Thankfully, I have duplicates of these guys, since I have 2 of the starter sets from 9th edition, so I just stole the arm off of one of the other ones and used that. In another scenario, I probably would have just made a new barrel using some small tube-shaped styrene instead. Thankfully in this case, I had an easy way out, so I took it. While I let everything else settle, I got started on the bases. I decided to swap to some 40mm bases for these guys, that way I can proxy them with some flawless blades for the time being. Which means I'm going to have to match my Emperor's Children army basing scheme. I added hot glue to the bases and then stuck them down to some large sheets of cork. Once the glue cooled, I started breaking off the cork along the rim of the base, that way it matched the size. To add the crater in the middle, I took some old sprue cutters and started tearing away cork from the center, creating a large dip. I tried to keep it deeper in the center and raised it more towards the rims of the bases. After dry fitting the brains to the bases to see if they fit properly, I used some medium grit sandpaper to smooth it out a bit. Now to add that crater look, I ripped up some smaller, triangle-shaped pieces of cork. I cut the bottom of them at an angle and glued them to the outer parts of the bases. This should help sell the look of this being a crater. I added a few of these at different sizes randomly on each base. I wanted to add little rock spires as well, so I ripped up little circular pieces of cork and stacked them smaller and smaller one on top of the other, holding it all down with hot glue. To add a bit more texture to the bases, I used some crackle paste. This stuff looks pretty gnarly when you let it sit for a while, but if you give it a good mix, it'll come back to normal. I used a disposable brush to start heavily applying them to the bases. I made sure to really cover the areas where the separate pieces of cork meet, that way it helps fill in the gaps as well. I put it on pretty thick, that way I can get some larger cracks on the surface. After getting these guys primed off camera, I started figuring out my base coats. Starting with the bases, I'm going for a red undercoat. My dropper bottle seemed to be clogged pretty good though, so I had to clear that out before moving on. After resolving that little side quest, I started painting up the bases. I'm only doing an undercoat right now since I have a plan for the base color later on. I used that same red on the Marines, only hitting it from above. I'm going for their pre-heresy colors, so I think I'm going for a more purple rather than a pink. I'm using a lot of warm undercoats to get this effect. I did a zenithal of pink on top of the red to add a bit more saturation. On top of that, I did a spray just above of alien purple, followed by a pure purple on top of that. I realized after all this painting that I somehow forgot to prime the power packs, so I used my favorite primer, Vallejo Mecha Primer, to get those quickly done up. I left those to dry a bit and went back to painting the Marines. I want to make the helmets a different color, so I based them with a cream off-white paint. I sprayed these only from above, that way I can keep the shadows underneath the helmets. I wanted to paint the shoulders the same color as the helmets, and I was not in the mood to do a ton of thin coats of white paint, so I decided to use some masking tape on the arms and airbrush the white onto the shoulders. I wasn't really feeling the purple tone that I did, so I wanted to try something different. I used a really light blue paint to hit only the high points of the models with an airbrush. I did this very controlled with my airbrush, making sure to just hit the peak points that the light source would hit. My theory is that the purple speed paint I'll use after this will make these bright points a very bright, vibrant purple. After airbrushing the speed paint, I realized I could not be more wrong. It ended up basically unifying everything into one solid purple shade, basically undoing all the layers I had done previously. But it did give me the exact shade of purple I wanted, so I guess that's a win? I think if I thinned down the speed paint a little more to a wash consistency and airbrushed it, that may have worked better. So, to still attempt to add those purple highlights, I used a bright purple airbrush paint, and once again hit only the highest parts of the model with a controlled airbrush. This got the job done pretty well. I guess I should have done this from the start, but hey, you live and you learn. Now that all the paint is dried, I can start with the brushwork. I really don't want to give up on the speed paint idea, so I tried to do it with a brush. I put some of the same speed paint on my wet palette and I watered it down to a wash consistency and started applying it all over the model. I think this did the job so much better. Watering it down a bit was definitely the trick. I got a nice rich purple tone, kept the highlights, and it did some of my shading for me as well. So I'd say this worked out pretty well. Before moving on, I touched up the shoulder pads to cover up any of the paint that I accidentally got on them. To wash and tint the shoulders and helmets, I used a red wash. I really like how red washes look over an off-white paint. It really adds warmth to the cream color. I did this on the helmets and the shoulders, wiping away any pooling parts with a damp brush. To get a bit more highlighting, I grabbed the light purple paint and used a dry brush to hit all of the raised edges. This added a lot more vibrancy to the color scheme. I wanted to go slightly brighter again, so I mixed some white into it and went over everything again with a dry brush, this time being a little bit more precise. Now for some of the early stage weathering. Using the same purple and white mixture, I ripped up a piece of sponge, making the surface really rough and uneven. This will give the paint chips a more random look. I dipped it into the paint and wiped off the excess onto a paper towel. I started tapping the surface of the model with it, leaving behind light purple paint chips. I tried to go a bit more heavy-handed on the edges and corners since that's where paint would naturally tend to chip off more. After that, I used a dark rust color and did the exact same thing, but this time trying only to put the chips over the same spots I did last time. Both of these colors of paint chips will give the illusion of depth. The lighter purple chips being more superficial armor damage, and the dark rust ones being deeper paint chips. Now that we got the messy part out of the way, it's time to tackle all the gold. I wanted to go for a more weathered old gold, so I think a base coat of dark brown will be a good start. I base coated all the shoulders, the shoulder trim, and the chest aquillas with it. And then on just the squad leader, I also painted his kneecaps as well. I usually like to make my squad leader stand out a little bit more among the rest of the group, so the color variation like this is a great easy way to do it. I started off with a bright gold paint. I roughly blocked in the gold only on the highest parts of the brown areas. I didn't do this super carefully since I was going to be weathering this down later anyways. I applied it to the aquila, the shoulder trim, and the other shoulder. After that, I used Pro Acryl's bright gold as a highlight. I used this just on the smallest parts within the last gold that I painted, acting as the highlights for the gold. To tie this all together, I used some gold speed paint. This unified the brown base coat with the other 2 layers of gold, making it feel less like patchwork and more like a unified chunk of metal. Once I got those done, I quickly picked out the decorative trim on the helmets with the same gold paints, being very careful not to let the paint spill over. The trim was very tiny, so I had to really watch my brushwork. Now that the gold was finished, I moved on to some of the other decorations like the leather pouches. With the same brown that I used earlier, I used 2 thin coats to give them all a base coat. While the paint was drying, I realized I didn't finish painting the top knot, so I got started on that. I started with a darker, more purpley red color for the base coat. I let that dry and then I jumped back to working on the leather. This was done in a really weird order, so sorry if the footage kind of jumps back and forth. Once that was drying, I went right back to highlighting and texturing the leather. To do this, I used multiple tan colored paints. I started with a darker tan, adding thin lines around the edges and corners of the leather. I also did some light strokes of tan going across the surface as well. This will simulate the leather becoming more aged and discolored. I did the same thing with a lighter tan paint. Honestly, it was looking pretty bad. I wasn't really a fan of the end result, so I decided to retry it. After watching some videos and looking at reference photos, I decided to give it another shot. I rebased them again with the same brown and started over. This time I started with a warm brown color rather than the tan. I think the warm tone to this brown will help sell the leather look a little bit more. This time I made sure to go a lot more fine and careful with it, stippling little dots along the edges of the leather to simulate the wear and tear. I essentially did the same steps as last time, but this time at a much smaller scale and more refined. I think that, plus the changing color choices, really helped fix the look. I then took one of the tan colors from earlier and did tiny highlights going along the previous steps to simulate some deeper and older weathering marks. To tie this all together, I watered down some snakebite leather contrast paint. This added a nice warm tone to it and also toned down some of the contrast as well. I think this really helped sell the leather look. There were a few more spots in the miniatures that I wanted to match with the top knots color. I used the same dark red paint to base coat the coverings on the bolt pistols. Bringing this bit of red into the color scheme will act as a nice third color to the color scheme. To highlight the bolt pistols, I used a vibrant red and a dry brush to roughly add in some highlights. The scratchiness will also help with the weathered look. I did the same thing with the top knot as well. For any exposed unpainted metal, I used some lead belcher. I did this for all the bolt guns' bodies. I almost forgot to paint the purity seals as well. I did the same steps as the leather on these guys, this time sticking to a more brighter tan color like I initially did before restarting. These colors will fit the parchment color a little bit better. I used the exact same techniques to paint the squad leader's tabard as well, but this time for the highlights I did tons and tons of thin lines going across the raised areas of the folds. Not only will this help show the light source hitting the raised surfaces, but it'll also add a nice texture to the fabric. Once those dried, I gave them a watered down coat of snakebite leather as well. And once the silver on the bolt pistols dried, I gave them a coat with some rattling grime. Now that all the painting was done, I could finally superglue the helmets to the bodies. I actually almost forgot to paint the exposed areas of the undersuit as well, so I used the Grim Black speed paint to quickly coat those areas in. I used a thin brush, that way I didn't accidentally get any of this paint on the purple. Alright, time to get those bases going. I kinda rushed out the basing scheme for my Emperor's Children in that last video that I made on them. I thought about using a different basing scheme for these 3 guys since this was kind of a one-off project, but I figured I'd try to use this as an opportunity to solidify the way I really want to base this army. And I have a new product I picked up that I wanted to try for it. I picked up this liquid enamel wash from my local hobby shop and figured it would be great for a Martian style basing scheme. My theory is that since it's essentially just pigment with some binder, the dried surface will be really matte and dusty looking, which is the exact look I want to go for. I mixed it up and started applying it. I used a disposable brush to heavy-handedly apply it to the bases. I feel like I had to use a lot more of the stuff than I expected, but I'm pretty sure that's because I was applying it over cork, which is naturally really porous. It tended to absorb a lot of it, so I think what I'll do next time is probably seal the cork first with either super glue or some Mod Podge. So for weathering these guys, I wanted to stick with my usual enamel paints, but this time I didn't want to try airbrushing it like I normally do. I think I'm going to try a more controlled method with a brush. This way I can be a little bit more controlled with how I do it, and also gives me the opportunity to try out different colors at the same time, rather than just, coating the entire thing with one color. So let's try that out. I gave the fellas a quick semi-gloss varnish off camera to protect them from the enamel paints. This will also give them a nice smooth surface for the washes to flow into as well. I poured some enamel paints onto my wet palette and filled up a small cup with some mineral spirits that I could use to thin them down the washes. I wanted to try applying these with a brush this time rather than spraying them with an airbrush and removing 90% of it. The airbrush method is great, but it wastes a lot of paint and it isn't really great for your lungs either, so I wanted to try a more controlled method like this. This also allows me to experiment with multiple colors of enamel washes on the same model. I gave the models a nice once over with some damp earth, really thinning it down. This let it flow into all the cracks, but also slightly tinted the surface of the model, giving it a more grimy appearance. For certain raised areas like the blank shoulders, I used a brush soaked in mineral spirits to remove some of the enamel paint from the top of the surface. This should clean it up a bit and also help create some artificial shadows as well. After that, I used a Q-tip to clean up some of the areas a bit more. So far, just from this one paint, they're already looking really nice, but I wanted to try some others as well. I glued them all down to their bases first just to make it a little easier to handle while painting. I wanted to add a verdigris to the gold, so I used the green filter for this. These technically aren't the same as enamel washes. Filters are meant more to be used as like a tint and a subtle color changing method, since they're very watery and very low in pigment, but I wanted to give it a shot on these guys. The effect was very subtle, but I'm not too worried about it since I plan on adding some more verdigris later on. For the exposed metal on the gun, I wanted a bright orange rust tone. I watered some of that down and let it flow into all the cracks. This will give it a nice dry and dusty appearance. I wanted to add a bit more shade to the shoulders, so I used a dark gray enamel wash in the recesses, then feathered it out with a brush to get a nice subtle shadow effect. I really like how this part turned out. For some of the armor, I wanted to add some rust streaks as well. I used a more reddish brown rust color for this. I picked out some random spots on the armor, primarily areas that had vents or panel lining, then added small dots of the enamel paint along the lines. After letting it sit for a bit, I added a bit of mineral spirits to a brush and started making streaking motions downward on all the dots. This should pull the pigment down a bit and also get rid of some of it, leaving you with some really nice subtle rust streaks on the armor. It's subtle, but I think it does add a lot, especially when you do this on a larger scale like on vehicles. So to tackle the verdigris again, I'm going to use some good old dirty down paints. Make sure when you use this stuff, you shake the hell out of it. It really gunks up when you don't use it a while. Once it was nice and shook, I applied it to the recesses of the gold on all the armor. This effect looks really rough and messy right now, but after it dries, it creates a nice matte effect. These paints are also water soluble, so once it dries, you can come back in with a damp paintbrush and remove some of the excess, leaving more subtle effects in the deeper recesses of the gold. I left the swords for last since I wasn't sure if I was going to go more realistic or fantasy with them. Since I'm going for a more weathered look for these guys, I decided to go for the bare metal sword. I base coated the blades with a matte black first and left it to dry. I then used a dry brush with some lead belcher and very roughly applied it to the blades. My intention was to make it look really uneven and rough, leaving very thin bits of black showing underneath to give the impression of an old blade with a lot of use. The last bit of painting I wanted to do was add a dry brush of rich gold over the verdigris, just to bring back a little bit of that pop. I did this with a very small dry brush, making sure not to get any of the gold on the purple parts of the armor. For the final step, I used some pigments. I used a color that matched the base, and with an old brush I started roughly applying it to the base as well as the feet of the miniatures. I really want to sell the look that they're running through a dusty Martian landscape, so naturally a lot of that debris would kick up onto their armor. Finally, the rims of the bases were painted black, and I called these guys finished. Now that these guys are all finished, I gotta say I'm pretty happy with the end result. I got to have a lot of firsts working on these guys. I've never really painted purple before, so that was a ton of fun to do also. This was also the first time I kinda did brushwork with enamels as well. I think I'm gonna try to experiment a bit more with that from now on. Like I said, the airbrush method is nice, but it wastes a lot of the paint, and with a brush I feel like I can really control what I'm doing more. The bases were also a blast and it helped me figure out how I wanted to do them on the rest of my army. I think for the time being, these guys are going to be a nice temporary flawless blade proxy until I get the official models. Once again, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who helped me get past 1,000 subscribers. I gave my whole thank you note in the last Q&A video, but genuinely again, thank you. I didn't think I'd get this far this quickly. I thought for sure this would have taken me like years to get to this point. So I'm really excited to keep moving forward and making content for everybody. I still have the Dreadnought video in the works as well that should hopefully be out by the end of September. But what I'm really excited about is the October video. It's going to be a Halloween special with lots of fun theming and stuff like that. It's literally all I've been thinking about content-wise lately, so I'm really pumped to get started on making that. So again, thank you so much to everyone for all the love and support. I won't let you guys down. Also, I haven't really advertised it much, but there is a Plaid Hobbies Discord that I opened as well. It'll be right here on screen for you guys to join. The link will also be in the description as well. So feel free to stop by if you want. And with that, this has been Plaid Hobbies. Thank you for watching. Thank you for 1,000 subscribers. And I'll see you in the next episode.
And now, folks, we thank you for joining us tonight. We hope this evening was filled with love and entertainment, and that you happily sleep through the night and join us again tomorrow. Good night, and sleep well.